During the years of experience I've had playing and learning about action games, I feel that there are some points of criticism that are self-evident. For example, action games should not have prolonged segments where a player's movement is restricted, also known as the walkie-talkie segments. They're bad due to the way that they break the game's pacing, while also harming replayability. Yet, through my escapades on the internet and in real life, I've found that these criticisms aren't universal. One specific instance is an argument that I had in real life about the merits and faults of DMC Devil May Cry's combat. The argument eventually hit a roadblock when I mentioned that color-coded enemies broke game flow and restricted player options. I was then met with, "Why is that a bad thing? And if you don't like color-coded enemies, then you suck at the game." Today, I mean to convince them, and all of you, that this is one of the 7 deadly sins of action games. Before talking directly about action games, I wanted to talk about color-coded enemies and weakness patterns in other games, and why it isn't an immediate fault like in an action game. Let's talk about the easiest example that I could think of. Weaknesses in RPGs. Usually found in traditional RPGs like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, the player may notice that certain moves may work better on certain enemies. Fire may work on the tree guy, but not so much on the water turtle. This also applies to Pokemon and its type advantage system. In these particular cases, this is more an element of strategy, and usually doesn't restrict a player's options to using other moves or attacks. It's to reward players paying attention to NPC dialogue, design motifs, or even just being aware of that creature's mythology. It's another tool to consider when trying to finish a fight with as little drain on resources as possible. It helps that RPGs are also more focused on the strategizing both in and out of combat than most action games. Then there are adventure games like Zelda and Okami. Color-coded enemies in those games, if they aren't meant to denote a more powerful enemy, are usually meant to be solved like a puzzle and make rare appearances. While you could say the same about action games, which I'll go over why you shouldn't in a bit, adventure games are more geared toward puzzle solving and exploration of the world around the player. Thus, making an enemy that is a light puzzle make more sense. Why then, if I don't have trouble with color-coded enemies in other games, would I have an issue with them in action games? It ultimately becomes an issue of the intent of an action game and the intent of the other games I've talked about. Why might someone pick up an action game rather than something of a different genre? A puzzle or fighting game, perhaps? A puzzle fighting game? No? Okay. Picking up an action game may just simply be more exciting or easier than picking up something else. An action game could also contain a good story or intriguing implications, or, and this is why I play them, it contains a rich combat system that promotes player expression. I want to define that term real quick just in case anyone's confused. Player expression is when a game allows a player to use the game's resources to show a distinct personality through play. For example, my Nero gameplay is very different from Donguri's Nero gameplay, which is different from Bash TSV's. All of us are using the game's mechanics to express ourselves differently. You can find player expression in strategy games, Tetris, and even in RPGs to a degree. What makes action games wholly unique is that it attempts to use combat to foster player expression, rather than problem solving or party layout. Consider the newest God of War game. As the game progresses, the player will choose various new moves for Kratos. These new moves give the player more options in combat, leading to them changing their playstyle and expressing their core playstyle differently. When all moves are unlocked, the player can express themselves in a myriad of ways by choosing which moves to use and when to use them for certain situations. This is also true for basically every other action game, all of which ask you to purchase new moves using some in-game currency. The progression system is meant to ease you into more options to express your form of combat. If player expression is the core of action games, then anything to block or prevent player expression would count as a negative in my book. In both DMC Devil May Cry and God of War 2018, the player is halted in their expression by color-coded enemies. Want to perform an angel combo on a red enemy? Well, too bad. Switch to your axe or gloves, then you can actually play the game. Want to use Leviathan axe combo on a blue enemy? Well, too bad. You bounce off like an idiot. As though the game is taunting us and telling us how to play it exactly the way it wants us to. It's not extremely challenging to see a color and switch a weapon. It does count as a downer, because your options have been arbitrarily restricted in a game about giving you options to express yourself. It suddenly becomes a game of square peg goes into square hole. It's tedious, and it doesn't belong in a game that's meant to give the player a sense of freedom once the mechanics are mastered. I think it's important to mention these sorts of things so that we don't end up having action games that restrict player expression and force everyone into solving every combat situation in the same exact way. It's what makes games like Devil May Cry 4 infinitely replayable, and allows every video of Bayonetta to be unique. I hope that Bayonetta 3 and other major action games in the future focus on giving players as many options as possible to express themselves. That way we could have a game rivaling Devil May Cry 4 in mechanical complexity.